War teaches you many things, but one lesson stays with you longer than any other. Mercy never announces itself. It doesn't arrive with explanation or warning. Sometimes it comes silently, from the very person you were trained to hate. And when it does, it can haunt you for the rest of your life. On December 17, 1944, Lieutenant Ed Cottrell was certain he was about to die. He was 22 years old, flying a badly damaged P-47 Thunderbolt over Belgium. His windshield was covered in oil. His engine was failing. Enemy fighters were closing in from both sides. He had seconds left, maybe less. And then something happened. Something so unexpected that Ed Cottrell would spend the next 79 years trying to understand it. This is the story of that moment, and the long road it took for him to finally learn why it happened. The date was December 17, 1944, the second day of the Battle of the Bulge. Across Belgium, the situation was desperate. In a final gamble, Nazi Germany had launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, pushing American forces backward in freezing conditions. The goal was bold and dangerous: split the Allied lines in half, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. German Tiger tanks rolled through snow-covered roads, advancing toward the critical crossroads town of Bastogne. If Bastogne fell, the entire Allied position in the region could collapse. Standing in their way were exhausted American ground troops and a handful of fighter squadrons flying from airfields dangerously close to the front lines. One of those units was the 493rd Fighter Squadron of the 48th Fighter Group, known as the Grim Reapers, stationed at Saint-Trond Airfield in Belgium. It was the closest American airbase to the fighting, and that made it one of the most dangerous. Lieutenant Ed Cottrell was one of their pilots. He was from Slippery Rock, Pennsylvania, a quiet college town far removed from the chaos of war. Just 2 years earlier, he had earned his pilot's license through Roosevelt's civilian pilot training program. In April of 1944, he married his college sweetheart, Millie. Shortly afterward, he earned his wings and shipped out to Europe. Now he flew combat missions in the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the largest single-engine fighter aircraft built by any nation during the war. Heavy, powerful, and rugged, the Thunderbolt was designed to absorb punishment and keep flying. Cottrell's plane was named Our Mary. On the cold morning of December 17, 1944, Lieutenant Ed Cottrell and 11 of other P-47s lifted off from a snow-covered runway. Their mission was clear: locate German armor and stop it before it reached American lines. They flew low over frozen fields and forests, each Thunderbolt carrying bombs for a ground attack strike. Soon they spotted a German convoy moving below them. The first 4 aircraft dove down and released their bombs, explosions tearing through the column. Cottrell's flight of 4 moved in next. That was when the radio crackled. A warning from the squadron leader. German fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109s, were diving out of the clouds straight toward them. It was an ambush. Cottrell spotted one of the German fighters lining up on his flight leader and immediately radioed a warning, but the German pilot adjusted his angle. In the next instant, Cottrell felt a massive explosion rip through his aircraft. Black oil erupted across his windshield, completely blinding him. The powerful Pratt & Whitney radial engine, which had been roaring moments earlier, began to sputter and die. 8 of its 18 cylinders were destroyed. Cottrell was no longer flying a fighter. He was piloting a 14,000-pound glider over enemy territory. He opened the canopy, hoping to see around the oil-soaked glass, and radioed that he had been hit. He turned west, trying to coax the crippled plane toward Allied lines.
The Thunderbolt struggled along at just 120 miles per hour, barely above stall speed, leaking oil and smoke, barely holding altitude at around 2,000 feet. Cottrell knew the truth. He was helpless. Then he saw movement to his right. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 pulled up alongside him. He turned his head to the left. Another Messerschmitt Bf 109.
The two German fighters crossed behind him, sliding perfectly into firing position. Cottrell tightened his grip on the controls, bracing himself for the impact that would end his life. Seconds passed. Nothing happened. No gunfire, no explosion. Instead, the two German fighters pulled in close, so close their wingtips were only feet away from his own. They matched his speed, flying in formation with his wounded aircraft. Cottrell could hardly believe what he was seeing. They had a perfect kill, a defenseless enemy, an easy victory. And they weren't taking it. As the three aircraft flew together, Cottrell realized something even more astonishing. The German pilots weren't just sparing him, they were protecting him. They stayed on either side of his Thunderbolt, guarding him from other German fighters as his dying engine carried him across fields, forests, and small Belgian villages. For long minutes, the war faded into the background. There were no enemies here, only three pilots suspended in cold air, bound by an unspoken understanding. Eventually, they reached the bomb line, the invisible boundary between German-controlled territory and Allied airspace. One of the German pilots raised his hand and formed a circle with his thumb and forefinger. A simple gesture. Good luck. You're okay now. They waved. Then the two Messerschmitts peeled away and vanished back into German skies. Cottrell was alone again, alive, confused, and overwhelmed. He radioed desperately, asking anyone who could hear him where St. Trond airfield was. A calm voice replied, telling him to turn 90 degrees. He would run right into it. Approaching from an unfamiliar direction, he finally spotted the runway through the oil-streaked canopy. Just seconds before his wheels touched the ground, the engine seized completely. The propeller froze. Cottrell made a dead-stick landing, rolling to a stop on the Belgian tarmac. He climbed out of the cockpit, dropped to his knees, and kissed the ground. He had survived, but not everyone had. His roommate and close friend, Second Lieutenant Art Summers, had been shot down in the same battle and crashed into a nearby field. He did not survive. Years later, Cottrell made a promise. If he reached the age of 100 and was physically able, he would skydive again in memory of Summers and another friend, Theodore H. Smith, killed on January 1, 1945. In November 2021, at age 99, just 2 months shy of his 100th birthday, Ed Cottrell kept that promise. He jumped from a plane at Fort Bragg, honoring the men who never came home. Cottrell went on to fly 65 combat missions, earned 9 air medals, served 28 years in the Air Force Reserves, retiring as a lieutenant colonel, and spent decades as a university professor. He raised 2 daughters with Millie and lived what he called a great life. But one question never left him. Why? Why did those 2 German pilots choose mercy? For nearly 8 decades, he told the story to anyone who would listen. He always said the same thing. He owed his life to 2 men whose names he did not know. In the 2000s, Cottrell began traveling back to Europe, revisiting the places where he had fought. In Bastogne, he met historian Paul Aschner, a specialist in the Battle of the Bulge. When Cottrell told him about the escort in the sky, Aschner paused and then said something extraordinary. "I think I know who they were." On December 23, 2023, exactly 79 years later, Ed Cottrell stood at a crash site near Bonn, Germany, at 102 years old.
Across from him stood Karl-Heinz Bosser, a former German fighter pilot, 99. Bosser's Messerschmitt had been shot down on December 17, 1944, in the same battle. He had bailed out, badly injured, and spent weeks in a hospital before returning to duty. Through years of research, Oshner had connected the records. The two men spent hours together, speaking through a translator, piecing together that day in the sky. Bosser explained what Cottrell had wondered about for most of his life. When he and his wingman saw the crippled P-47 struggling to stay airborne, they made a decision. The war was clearly being lost. Shooting down a defenseless pilot wouldn't change the outcome, only end another young life. So they chose mercy. They chose to let him live. At the end of their meeting, the two old pilots embraced. "We are friends now," Cottrell said. "We will never be enemies again." Karl-Heinz Bosser turned 100 in January 2025. Ed Cottrell passed away peacefully just 2 months later at age 103. But before he died, he finally had his answer. 79 years earlier, Ed Cottrell kissed the ground in Belgium, grateful to be alive. And nearly 80 decades later, he met the man who made it possible. Because some friendships don't begin in peace. Some begin at 2,000 feet over Belgium, when two enemy pilots choose compassion instead of death. For Ed Cottrell, the moment did not end when his wheels touched the runway. It followed him home. It followed him into classrooms, into family dinners, into quiet moments late at night when the world was calm and his mind was not. The war ended, uniforms were folded away, medals were placed in drawers, but that image never faded. Two enemy fighters, flying so close he could see the pilots' helmets, choosing not to fire. He replayed those seconds again and again, trying to find logic in something that defied everything he had been taught about war. In training, there were rules. In combat, there were objectives. You protected your own. You destroyed the enemy. Mercy was not in the manual. And yet, mercy had found him at 2,000 feet. For years after the war, Cottrell avoided talking about it publicly. Not because he was ashamed, but because he feared disbelief. Stories of kindness between enemies did not fit easily into a world still healing from destruction. But among fellow veterans, when the conversations turned quiet and honest, he would sometimes tell it. And every time, the reaction was the same: silence, followed by disbelief, followed by respect. As time passed, the question only grew heavier. Who were they? Were they young like him? Did they survive the war? Did they ever think about that day?
Cottrell wondered if, somewhere in Germany, two men were living ordinary lives carrying the same memory, or if they had been lost to the same skies that had almost claimed him. He tried to find answers, but records were scattered, incomplete, or destroyed. Air combat over the Ardennes was chaotic. Pilots went missing daily. Names vanished into smoke and snow. The war, it seemed, wanted the mystery to remain untouched. Still, Cottrell never stopped telling the story. He told his daughters. He told his students. He told strangers at air shows and memorials. Every time, he ended the same way. "I'm alive because two German pilots chose not to kill me." As the years passed, age slowed his body, but sharpened his purpose. In his 90s, when most men were retreating from the world, Cottrell leaned into it. He returned to Europe, standing once again on the frozen ground of Belgium, feeling the weight of history beneath his feet. He visited cemeteries, traced names carved in stone, and honored friends who never came home. It was during one of these trips that fate finally shifted. In Bastogne, while speaking at a small gathering, he met historian Paul Oshner.
Unlike most listeners, Oshner didn't just hear a powerful story, he heard a puzzle. Dates, aircraft types, locations, squadrons, all the small details Cottrell had carried for decades suddenly mattered. Oshner began digging. Flight logs, German unit records, crash reports, pilot rosters. It took years, but slowly the fog lifted. Patterns emerged, names surfaced. And then one name stood out: Karl-Heinz Bosser. When Oshner contacted Cottrell with the possibility, the old pilot was stunned. After nearly 80 decades, the idea that the man might still be alive felt unreal. Hope and fear mixed together. What if he was wrong? What if the memory didn't match? But when the meeting finally happened, doubt disappeared. Standing near Bonn, at the site where Bosser's Messerschmitt had come down all those years ago, the two men looked at each other, not as enemies, not as symbols of nations, but as survivors. Time had bent their backs and whitened their hair, but the memory connected them instantly. Through a translator, they spoke slowly, carefully, filling in gaps left by history. Bosser described the cold air, the damaged American plane struggling to stay aloft, the moment he realized the pilot inside had no chance. He spoke of exhaustion, of loss, of knowing deep down that the war was slipping away. There was no honor in killing him, Bosser explained, only another mother losing a son. For Cottrell, the words landed with quiet force. The mystery was finally solved, not with strategy or ideology, but with humanity. When they embraced at the end of their meeting, it was not a symbolic gesture. It was two men closing a circle that had been open for 79 years. Afterward, they stayed in touch. Phone calls crossed oceans that once divided them. They spoke of families, of aging bodies, of gratitude. The war no longer stood between them. When Karl-Heinz Bosser celebrated his 100th birthday in January 2025, Ed Cottrell sent his congratulations across the Atlantic. 2 months later, when Ed Cottrell passed away peacefully at 103, the question that had followed him his entire life was finally at rest. He had lived long enough to understand why he was spared. And perhaps that is the quiet power of this story. Not that mercy exists in war, but that even in its darkest moments it can still appear, unannounced, unexpected, from the last place you would ever look for it. Because some friendships are born in classrooms or neighborhoods, and some are born in the frozen skies over Belgium, when two enemy pilots choose compassion instead of death.